Good evening. Today we're going to come from page 174 and we're going to begin the discussion on the lost cause. Explained. Explain Like I'm a Racist 5-year-old began as a takeoff of the popular subreddit Explain Like I'm 5, which simplifies complex issues into easily understandable, digestible bites. While it was meant to break down the complicated issues of race, economics, and politics into a conversational form that even a bigoted toddler could understand, the character only known as Racist Baby soon became one of my best friends. Although his parents seem a little bigoted, RB often stops by, unannounced, and peppers me with questions. I tolerate him because I feel it is my duty to prevent Racist Baby from becoming Racist Man. Hey, Racist Baby, why are you carrying a cape? Well, my daddy keeps telling me the South shall rise again. I'm from Mississippi, and I just wanted to make sure I'm ready when I get the ability to fly. No, my little baby bigot, I'm sorry to tell you this, but you're probably not going to grow wings. Your dad is talking about the Confederacy. What is the Confederacy? The Confederate States of America was created in 1861 when 11 southern states decided they no longer wanted to be a part of America. So they took their ball, and by their ball, I mean slaves, and left, prompting the Civil War. They referred to it as seceding, which sounds nobler than what it really is: treason. When I was 12, I told my mother that I was no longer subject to her rules, and she had no dominion over my bedroom because I was seceding from the household. Just as the southern states found out, secession did not go well. Why did they secede? Slavery. And that's it. Just slavery. But my textbook says that it was about states' rights, not slavery. How do I know you're correct? Well, they actually wrote it down. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to commit treason by officially declaring that its citizens didn't want to be part of the United States if it meant they couldn't treat black people as property. The declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the federal union was written as if it were a sequel to the Declaration of Independence. But instead of spelling out their grievances against their version of the tyrannical Great Britain, their entire list was just variations of, y'all won't let us have slaves. The government had denounced as sinful the institution of slavery, the Carolinians whined. They have permitted open establishment among them of societies whose avowed subject is to disrupt the peace and allure the property of citizens of other states. They have encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes, and those who remain have been incited by emissaries, books, and pictures to servile insurrection. You know what? Now that I read that, you might be right. It wasn't only about slavery. South Carolina left the Union in part because Northern abolitionists apparently kept reading books and showing pictures to enslaved people. My bad. They probably promoted the myth of the lost cause. We'll continue with part 2 tomorrow. Good evening. For part 2, we're going to start from page 176. How'd they lose their cars? I thought they rode horses back then. No, RB. The lost cause is an ongoing ideology that promotes the Confederacy as a valiant cause undertaken by brave men. They believe the Civil War wasn't about slavery, and the Confederates weren't racist. But my dad says slavery wasn't racist because things were different back then. Therein lies the problem. Even if your ancestors didn't think of it as evil back then, we do now. Championing a bygone era that fought for human bondage is like sitting back and fondly remembering the good old days when a man could beat his wife for burning the pot roast. So, Confederate symbols are racist because they symbolize slave owning? Not quite. Although the entire reason for the Confederacy's existence was to preserve the peculiar institution of black people as human chattel, most Confederate symbols have absolutely nothing to do with the Civil War. I don't think that's right. My grandpa has a Confederate flag and he says it represents our heritage. Want to see a picture? Oh, that's not the Confederate flag. The first Confederate flag looked almost exactly like the U.S. flag, except it had fewer stripes and stars. But the United Confederation of Slaveholders hated that flag because it resembled the American flag, and in battle, they were hard to tell apart. In fact, you've probably never seen any of the actual flags that officially represented the Confederate States of America. The Confederate flag you're talking about originated from a design by William Thompson in 1863. And for him, there was no confusion about the true meaning of the flag that has now come to represent Southern heritage. He said, "As a people, we are fighting to maintain the heaven-ordained supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race. A white flag would thus be emblematic of our cause." He called that flag the white man's flag. But that was revised into a third version, and the proliferation of that flag is all thanks to a group of white frat boys. According to historian Leroy Stafford Boyd, in 1812, a group of University of North Carolina students founded the fraternity Ku Klux Adelphon, the official name of an order that also went under the names of Circle of Brothers, Kappa Alpha and the Alpha Society. Kappa Alpha began to emerge with independent chapters throughout the South until the fraternity essentially went extinct just before the Civil War. In October 1865, defeated Confederate General Robert E. Lee officially became president of Washington College, now Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. 2 months later, on December 21st, 1865, a new Kappa Alpha order was founded there. Confederate veteran Samuel Zenas Amen is celebrated as the frat's practical founder because of his idolization of Lee and the Confederacy, as described in early KA literature. Southern in its loves, it took Stonewall, Jackson, and Lee as its favorite types of the perfect knight. Caucasian in its sympathies, it excluded the African from membership. And what better symbol for this fraternity than a star-sprinkled banner flown by the great white knights Lee and Jackson? The flag you know as the Confederate flag is actually the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia under the command of General Robert E. Lee. The new KA wasn't limited to college campuses either. Members could form chapters called clans in surrounding counties to create a circle of brothers. 3 days after Kappa Alpha 2.0 founding, 6 men, including former Confederate soldiers, gathered in Pulaski, Tennessee, and started a spin-off fraternity that, according to Leroy Stafford Boyd, was also based on the Kappa Alpha rituals. This group modified the name of the original Kappa Alpha and translated it to the hillbilly pronunciation from the Greek, keklos, meaning ring or circle, and clan, meaning brothers or family. They called themselves the Ku Klux Klan. In multiple issues of the group's newsletter, The Journal, a heralded Kappa Alpha Order alumnus, Thomas J. Dixon Jr., insisted that Kappa Alpha need not fear to claim credit for suggesting the movement that culminated in the Ku Klux Empire. Dixon would also famously start to get women involved in their organization. I'll see you tomorrow for part 3. Good evening. For part 3, we're going to come from the middle of page 178. Wait, I didn't see any ladies at my dad's meetings. Well, my little kindergarten Klansmen, that wasn't always the case. In 1894, about 70 miles from where the Klan was founded, a group of white women united disparate pro-Confederate groups under one umbrella called the United Daughters of the Confederacy, UDC. Instead of terrorist activities, these women had a more targeted approach in venerating the Confederate symbology. While the ladies affiliated with the UDC did not create or substantially contribute to the precepts of the Lost Cause mythology, this group of white women was largely responsible for mainstreaming it. In fact, here's a quote from Thomas J. Dixon speaking directly to the UDC. Every clubhouse of the United Daughters of the Confederacy should have a memorial tablet dedicated to the Ku Klux Klan. There would be a monument not to one man, but to 550,000 men to whom all Southerners owe a debt of gratitude for how our beloved Southland could have survived the reign of terror is a big question. The Lost Cause was always part of the clandestine white supremacist clubhouse dogma, but it was the United Daughters of the Confederacy who supercharged it with one of the most successful marketing campaigns in American history. Historian Karen L. Cox argues that the Confederate tradition, as we know it, was formed by these organized groups of white women who wanted to perpetuate the myth that states' rights, not slavery, caused the Civil War by painting an idealized portrait of the antebellum South, one that romanticized white paternalism and African American slavery and glorified the valor of Confederate soldiers. And clearly, that belief has held. According to a 2019 Washington Post SSRS poll, 41% of Americans believe the Civil War was about something other than slavery. A July 2020 Morning Consult poll showed that 43% of Americans believed the Confederate flag was a symbol of Southern pride. Only 39% agreed that it was a symbol of racism. How did they do that? By casting white supremacy as a part of Southern values. They started by lionizing white supremacist turncoats as champions for Southern culture. Have you ever seen a Confederate monument? Of course, I've seen a lot of them. That's what we do on vacations. They're like my Confederate Army figurines, but bigger. My mommy says I could see them all before they're all torn down and our history is erased. Well, it's going to take quite a while. A 2016 analysis by the Southern Poverty Law Center found 718 monuments and statues to Confederate icons on public property across the country, the vast majority of which were funded by one group, the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Most of the statues were erected more than 50 years after the Civil War. In fact, when the SPLC looked at the history of these monuments and places named after Confederate icons, they found that surges in dedications and namings coincided with two periods. The first began around 1900 and includes the institution of Jim Crow laws and the nativist monuments of the 1920s that revived the Klan after its immediate formation. The second began in the early 1950s through the late 1960s during the segregationalist backlash against the civil rights movement. Between those two eras, the UDC focused their efforts on fundraising, building their ranks, and spitting on black kids who tried to integrate their schools. The UDC partially funded the largest shrine to white supremacy in the history of the world, a more than 12,000 square foot carving of Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson located at a stone quarry just east of Atlanta. In 1915, at the place now known as Stone Mountain Park, landowner Samuel Venable granted perpetual rights to the Ku Klux Klan to hold meetings, formally kickstarting the modern era of the KKK. Helen Plain, the UDC charter member who conceived the Stone Mountain Memorial, initially intended for it to include the Klan because, as she told the initial sculptor, I feel it is due to the Klan, which saved us from Negro domination and carpetbag rule, that it be immortalized on Stone Mountain. Why not represent a small group of them in their nightly uniform approaching in the distance? The first sculptor hired to carve Stone Mountain was selected to begin his work in 1916, but ran out of time and money. But after the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision brought desegregation to Georgia, donations poured into the UDC's coffers, allowing them to complete their work. The park finally opened as a tourist attraction on April 14, 1965, exactly 100 years to the day after President Abraham Lincoln was shot by a white supremacist. Part 4 will be up tomorrow. Good evening. For part 4, we're going to start at the bottom of page 180. Wow, that timing is a little funny. But maybe they really love their veterans. Oh, my little Confederate kiddo. The United Daughters of the Confederacy was as concerned about preserving the memory of Confederate soldiers as your dad's choir members are concerned with roasting marshmallows on open crosses. By the turn of the 20th century, many of the women who were actual wives and daughters of Civil War veterans were either dead or suffering from bouts of the vapors. But instead of disintegrating, the UDC saw a surge in membership fueled by the growing determination to separate the races with Jim Crow laws. At the 14th annual meeting of the North Carolina Division of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, one of the speakers exalted the organization's virtues. You were the song of the Old South. You are the theme of the New South. And today, in this high hour of peace and commercialism, when men are prone to forget, we find you banded together, United Daughters of the Confederacy, all still loyal to Southern rights, democracy, and thank God, to white supremacy. Are you saying that they brainwashed people into loving the Civil War's losing side by building statues and waving a flag? The new generation of Southern belles were less concerned about memorializing veterans than they were about institutionalizing the tradition of white supremacy that the army of racists fought to uphold. And the statue thing was only part of their campaign to brainwash people into venerating white supremacists. The UDC's plan was multi-layered. Their National History Committee organized propaganda campaigns in school districts across this country, including its annual essay contest that rewarded children who wrote glowing reviews of the South's disbanded slave-owning utopia. They also sponsored parades, placed Confederate flags along the U.S. flags in schools across America, and even founded Children of the Confederacy chapters. But perhaps the Daughters' biggest impact was the way they shaped how kids like you learn about slavery. No single organization influenced the way educators teach the antebellum South and the Civil War more than the UDC. By World War I, the UDC had more members than any teachers' union, parent-teacher association, or historical society in America. The UDC's History Committee eventually became so powerful that they were not only allowed to choose which textbooks were acceptable for teaching history, but they began to write their own. We realize that the textbooks in history and literature which the children of the South are now studying are guilty not only of misrepresentations, but of gross omissions, refusing to give the South credit for what she has accomplished, wrote Mildred Lewis Rutherford. As historian of the UDC and one vitally interested in all that pertains to the South, I have prepared, as it were, a testing or measuring rod. Committees appointed by boards of education or heads of private institutions and their teachers can apply this test when books are presented for adoption, so that none who really desire the truth need be hampered in their recommendations for acceptance or rejection of such books. And so, fictions were created and perpetuated in schools across the country. In 1922, after David S. Muzzey's American History textbook for more than a decade, the North Carolina Textbook Commission effectively banned the textbook from schools because it taught students that slavery caused the Civil War. In 1957, UDC's sanctioned textbook claimed that Virginia enslaved Africans were generally happy and insisted that Negroes went about in a cheerful manner, making a living for themselves and for those whom they worked. A fourth grade textbook suggested that students draw pictures of the Klan and make replicas of the Confederate flag. The white people who had lived in Alabama before the war had no special protection. Read Exploring Alabama, a 1970 textbook on the state's history. They appeared helpless, and many of them were frightened. Finally, some of the people took matters into their own hands. They organized secret societies to help protect their special interests. The best known of these was the Ku Klux Klan. I'll see you tomorrow for the next part. Good evening. For part 5, we're going to begin at the bottom of page 182. But my daddy says the flag represents my Southern heritage. You're from the South. Why don't you like it? Well, RB, in 1948, Southern Democrats walked out of the Democratic National Convention and formed their own party. The States' Rights Democratic Party, more commonly referred to as the Dixiecrats, to protest integration. Soon, the flag we now know as the Confederate flag became a symbol that represented the staunch opposition to liberal values that the civil rights movement was trying to impose on Jim Crow states. After the University of Alabama was ordered to integrate its campus, the college's Kappa Alpha chapter started flying the flag as a symbol of their heritage and the Southern way of life, prompting most of the school's white fraternities to follow suit. In 1956, Georgia incorporated the banner into its state flag, even though it never represented the state during the Confederacy. South Carolina's General Assembly passed a concurrent resolution to fly the flag at its state house in 1962. None of these states ever mentioned the Civil War in their reasoning for hoisting a flag in honor of the defeated white conduct. Like the KKK, the Kappa Alpha Order, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy, their only concern was preserving white supremacy and segregation. Oh, I heard about segregation. My daddy calls it the natural order. I'm sure he does, you brainwashed brat. Anyway, at first, the United Daughters of the Confederacy tried to prevent people from using the Lee flag, not because it was offensive, but because it was inaccurate. But they eventually gave up trying to correct the narrative. Why'd they give up? Because it was their fault. They were the ones who had prompted the myth of states' rights, heritage, and this Southern culture. They were the ones who cloaked their anti-black rhetoric in an ahistorical narrative. While the Klan was lynching and the Kappa Alpha members were institutionalizing racism, the United Daughters of the Confederacy were the ones who were rewriting the original story that recast white supremacist villains as heroes. But if people have been taught that the Confederate flag represents their heritage, then is it racist? If your dad taught you that he believes 2 + 2 = 5, does that mean that everyone else should accept it? Should we change all the calculators to accommodate your dad's incorrect math tutorial? Final part tomorrow. Good evening. For the conclusion of The Lost Cause Explained, we will be coming from the middle of page 184. Wait, I'm still trying to add up 2 + 2. My point is this. It doesn't matter what anyone believes. The truth is that Confederate monuments celebrate men who committed treason against this country. The current Confederate flag represents a war to preserve the practice of human trafficking, rape, and murder. The only reason it reemerged into the national consciousness is because segregationists wanted to deny black people their constitutional rights. But if it's so bad, then why does my dad love the Confederate symbols so much? For the same reason, 43-year-old dudes try to tell you about the time they scored 38 points in high school basketball, or how guys who pledged a fraternity 27 years ago will throw out their backs trying to put on impromptu step shows at the club as if they're still in college. They have the same sickness that makes Mick Jagger wear skin-tight leather pants, a distorted, delusional self-image cemented in their glory days. Some people stay stuck in the past because the present and the future don't look that good. 1865 was about the last time white people were really winning. Since then, they have been engaged in a bunch of divisionary tactics to try to keep the playing field from being level and keep them from having to compete against the rest of America without the advantages their whiteness has endowed them with. It is the dread of staring truth and reality in the face and the finding out that they are inadequate. It is fear. So, should everything have to do with the Civil War be banned? Of course not. But celebrating the anguish, mistreatment, and subjugation of an entire people is also distasteful. When some people see Robert E. Lee, it reminds them of a deplorable part of American history. Imagine if your tax dollars went to maintaining symbols and history books that reinforce narratives of white supremacy, or having to see physical representation every day that reminds you of America's continued injustice towards your people. But once all the monuments to and symbols of the Confederacy become shameful, how are we, as Southerners, supposed to remember the Civil War? The same way we remember the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, World War I, World War II, and every other conflict in American history, with books. We don't need a statue of Saddam Hussein to remember Desert Storm. I don't think the lack of mustachioed enslavers will make us forget the deadliest war this country has ever fought. I know there are people who would rather whitewash the past and romanticize the antebellum days of Southern belles sitting on front porches sipping mint juleps, but there were also willing participants in almost a 250-year genocide. Maybe one day, one of its racist stupor draped in rebel flags and white supremacists' wet dreams, the South will rise again. And then you can come with me to the marshmallow roast? Nah, probably not.